Hello, and thank you for joining my lecture recital on the cultural identity and performance values of wind band music of Carlos Chávez. In wind band programming, music by Mexican composers has historically held a less significant role. According to a review of data generated by the College Band Directors National Association between 2015 and 2020, less than 1% of the composers featured were Mexican, and the majority of the works programmed were orchestral transcriptions. Additionally, the works were placed peripheral to other compositions long considered to be more significant of merit in the wind band canon. The assessment of prescribed music lists compiled by state music associations in Texas, Florida, Georgia, and Indiana also yielded similar results. However, several important works by Mexican composers exist for the wind band medium. Specifically, 3 original works for wind band by Carlos Chávez, Tejuantepec, Mañanas Mexicanas, and Zandunga Serenade, were written to cultivate and celebrate Mexican national identity. The purpose of this lecture recital is to highlight the development and historical performance practices of Mexican music through the analysis and performance of these 3 works. This lecture will also provide further historical context and ideas for concert programming for the wind band conductor. Beginning in 1519, the Spanish occupation and colonization of Mexico created an influx of missionaries dispatched to convert the population to Catholicism. With the missionaries came the musical practices of the church, including string instruments and European wind instruments. Testimony of early missionaries and archaeological evidence indicate that pre-Columbian native people used various wind instruments. Their music was identified as highly lyrical and focused on song and dance. Unfortunately, transcriptions of pre-Columbian music, melodies, rhythms, or tonal systems do not exist today. Eventually, colonialism imported European music, including operas, symphonies, and chamber works of the Baroque, Classical, and Romantic eras, and the Western tonal system and performance practices. When string instruments were introduced to the indigenous people, they were regarded as percussion instruments, ultimately changing and inventing new techniques for their performance. Transatlantic trade from Africa also influenced the changing culture of Mexico. As a result, African rhythms were added to the evolving musical style associated with the lower classes. The blended identity of natives, Europeans, and Africans in Mexico became known as mestizo. After Mexico's liberation from Spain, several composers utilized indigenous and mestizo styles in their compositions. For example, Anicito Ortega composed one of the first librettos in Spanish for his 1871 opera Guatimotzin. Manuel Ponce's work as a composer, music educator, and scholar of Mexican music connected the concert scene with the mostly forgotten tradition of popular song and Mexican folklore. Many of Ponce's compositions are strongly influenced by the harmonies and forms of traditional songs. He profoundly affected the next generation of composers, including Chávez, coming after the revolution of 1910 to 1920. Chávez continued integrating traditional folk music of Mexico into the classical stage. Chávez's appreciation for indigenous culture started early in life with family vacations to indigenous regions of Mexico. Chávez received his earliest musical training on the piano from his older brother Manuel. Chávez also studied music with Asuncion Parra, Manuel Ponce, and Luis Ogazon, with the latter having the most influence on his musical development. Chávez's compositional technique developed at a young age, producing his first work at the age of 12 and his first symphony at 17. Chávez's earlier years of musical development were also influenced by the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920, aligning himself with performance groups and affecting his perceptions of value in the underrepresented cultures of the indigenous and lower class people. After receiving a diploma from the National Conservatory of Music in 1920, Chávez began touring the world to promote his own works. In 1922, he met Paul Dukas in Paris, and together they traveled to Berlin, where Chávez secured a publishing deal. From Europe, Chávez visited the United States, where he met Aaron Copland, Edgar Varese, Henry Cowell, and other members of the League of Composers. Chávez contributed several articles to their publication Modern Music, explaining his progressive musical ideologies of harmony and form. Several of Chávez's contemporaries also wrote articles about his progressive approach to composition and quickly recognized the importance of his musical voice. In 1928, Chávez returned to Mexico and founded the Orquesta Sinfónica de Mexico, henceforth referred to as the OSM. Private funding, grants, and government support sustained the OSM until 1949. It became the standard for classical music activity in Mexico, functioning as a platform for Chávez and other Mexican composers to perform new works. During this time, Chávez also held governmental role of director of the Departamento de Bellas Artes, was a founding member of El Colegio Nacional, and founded the Instituto Nacional de Bellas Artes in 1947. These institutions provided more avenues for promoting his musical and cultural ideas. Chávez contributed to a major initiative of the Mexican government during the aftermath of the 1910-1920 revolution by defining, celebrating, and generating music and art unique to Mexican culture. The goal was to establish a cultural identity that was separate from European societies and thus associated with the values of the fallen regime. Mexican intellectuals, including Chávez, identified pre-Columbian indigenous peoples' cultures and mestizo culture as the foundation to build a national identity. Chávez set an agenda for the OSM to perform as much Mexican music as possible, with Mexican music being defined as Indian music of the ancient Mexicans, the music of Spanish or other origin implanted in Mexico, and the production in Mexico of a mixture of these elements. Chávez also received pressure to produce pre-Columbian music examples to bolster coinciding art festivals featuring the revival of pre-Columbian visual arts in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. These works include compositions Sinfonia India, Xochipilli, and the ballets El Fuego Nuevo and Los Cuatro Soles. Due to the lack of transcriptions and concrete representations of pre-Columbian music, Chávez had to discern indigenous melodic and rhythmic components. He researched the accounts of missionaries like Fray Juan de Torquemada to produce compositions that were high art signifiers of pre-Columbian or indigenous music. Chávez recognized that his compositions were symbolic or evocative of pre-Columbian music, adding in the program notes that the works were demonstrative of Aztec life, environments, and music. He even added the subtitle, An Imaginary Aztec Music, for the 1964 publication of Xochipilli, a chamber work for winds and percussion named after an Aztec god. As noted by Leonora Saavedra, Chávez's perceptions and construction of imaginary pre-Columbian music were created from a European conception, as the result of his schooling and studies of Western music. Regardless, his research, adaptations, and personal compositional style created a standard notion of what ancient indigenous people produced as music. Chávez's compositional technique developed from a personal analysis of orchestral masterworks by Beethoven and Mozart and his desire to challenge repetition and utilize impulsiveness as a means of invention. To Chávez's benefit, the music appreciated by contemporary critics and composers was modernist and progressive. Chávez's style of spontaneous composition and modern approaches to form, rhythm, and harmony made his musical style acclaimed, yet wholly singular among other composers of the era. In 1961, Chávez filled the Charles Eliot Norton Chair of Poetry at Harvard University. During his tenure, he published Musical Thought, based on the lectures he professed, identifying the values of traditional Western music and his opinions on them. He studied the use of repetition of rhythmic and motivic devices prevalent in classical and romantic styles of music. In contrast to this line of study, Chávez states, "The idea of repetition and variation can be replaced by the notion of constant rebirth, of true derivation, a stream that never comes back to its source, a stream in eternal development, like a spiral always linked to and continuing its original source, but always searching for new and unlimited spaces." Chávez valorized non-repetition, a technique now recognized as part of his compositional signature. Chávez's attention to non-repetition and musical impulse also affects his treatment of percussion. Chávez employs percussion as a musical element of color and melody rather than the typical use of motor rhythms or punctuation at cadence points. Lastly, Chávez's music is known for evoking impressions and musical atmospheres. As you will hear, many of his more modern style works, such as Mañanas Mexicanas and Zandunga Serenade, employ harmony and musical sound effects like bird calls and traditional musical yells to elicit the surrounding nature and life of Mexican people. Chapultepec. In concert with Chávez's celebration of national identity, he arranged 3 famous Mexican songs while skillfully incorporating his notions about repetition. Chapultepec was first composed in 1935 for orchestra and originally titled Obertura Republicana. The piece quickly became one of Chávez's most well-known works, and he later created and published a wind band arrangement in 1963 under the new name Chapultepec, which now stands as the title for both works. The title Chapultepec refers to Chapultepec Park in Mexico City, one of the largest and most famous urban parks in the Americas and a national monument of Mexico. The work is not an overture, as the original title suggests, and Chávez only added Obertura because, quote, "it sounded nice." Rather, Chapultepec is organized into 3 movements that each represent a set of well-known songs born out of the 1910 to 1920 Mexican Revolution. Movement 1, La Marcha Provenciana, is based on Marcha de Zacatecas. Movement 2, Vals Nostálgico, based on El Club Verde. And Movement 3, Canción de Adelita, based on the traditional song La Adelita. Movement 1, Marcha Provenciana, is a setting of Marcha de Zacatecas, originally composed by Genaro Codina in a private competition of compositions against fellow composer Fernando Villalpando. Family and friends selected Codina's composition as the winner. The Zacatecas Municipal Band premiered the work under the title Marcha Arechiga, dedicated to the governor of the city of Zacatecas, Jesus Arechiga. At this event, Arechiga proposed the title be changed to Marcha de Zacatecas, and it became the regional anthem of the municipality of Zacatecas. Chávez set La Marcha de Zacatecas with recognizable elements of a da capo march form, but he avoided adhering to traditional patterns of structure and accompaniment to indulge his ideas about repetition in music. The piece begins in C major with an introduction using a recognizable 16th-note fanfare associated with the original tune. The primary theme is also the same in melody and phrasing as Codina's setting, and a static 16th-note fanfare motif punctuates the melody every 4 bars. The accompaniment is the first noticeable differentiation from the original march. Chávez avoided the traditional umpa style in favor of a descending 8th-note line with accented downbeats for the low brass and long-held chords in the horns, which perform a unique bugle at the end of the first section. The form moves to the secondary theme in the dominant key with a more traditional accompaniment pattern, and then returns to the primary theme in the tonic. Chávez avoided repeating any of these sections, differing from Cordina's original markings, but did follow his placement of the break strain, a transitional phrase featuring alterations of short accented melody and accompaniment between low and high voices. The break strain would typically follow the trio section in American marches, but Cordina and Chávez used it to transition to a trio-like phrase. Chávez's break strain is presented in F major and concludes with a triplet-based fanfare quoted directly from the original tune as the final transitional material to the trio-like phrase. Continuing in F major, the trio-like phrase shares qualities with a traditional American march. For example, the greater transparency in orchestration and the shift of melodic focus to high voices. Chávez deviates from conventional practices by repeating the passage as a tutti variation with strong downbeats played by the percussion and an added counterline in the piccolo, second cornets, and trumpets. The work then recalls the opening fanfare in C major, similar to a da capo form. The primary theme is performed a final time with ascending eighth note accompaniment, different from the first presentation. As Chávez finally approaches the conclusion, utilizing the triplet fanfare from the break strain as transitional material, the outro develops similarly to a traditional classical ending, alternating between the dominant and tonic through rising eighth note sequences to a final cadence in C major. Movement 2, Vals Nostalgico, is based on Vals Claverde by Rodolfo Campandonico, one of the best known works throughout Mexico and the world due to its political significance and romantic flavor. The work was composed without commission during the 1910-1920 revolution as a response to the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. The color green, verde, was associated with the revolutionary movement, a backlash towards red, which represented the authoritarian regime of Diaz. Chávez set Vals Claverde in a symmetrical rondo form and excluded two themes from the original work, possibly to truncate the movement's performance time. The first 18 measures establish the key of C minor and function as an introduction with a direct statement of the primary theme accompanied by transparent orchestration. The next phrase repeats the primary theme, reusing the fermata on the first note of the melody, and with a drastic change in texture to tutti, indicating the song's first verse. An interesting component of this movement is how Chávez expands on a rhythmic hemiola used in the second theme for the closing material. Starting at measure 157, Chávez organizes the music into high and low voices, sharing the same rhythmic hemiola, but set apart by one beat. The juxtaposed hemiolas create a pulse on each beat of the measure, while simultaneously creating the feeling of an augmented waltz feel that spans across two bars. This change in motion interrupts the repetition of the melody and serves as an interesting cadential expansion, closing the work in the parallel key of E-flat major. Chávez captured this piece's romantic style with strategically placed fermatas to prolong the first note of the main melody, tempo markings for the significant fluctuation of phrases, and the use of many dynamic markings for dramatic changes in volume. Many of the lines include the instruction cantando, indicating a necessity for dramatic singing style of performance. The romantic style should be reinforced by adding dynamic expression to melodic lines that are void of any markings. Chávez also includes staccato and staccatissimo markings on the accompaniment patterns to emulate the articulations of a traditional mariachi ensemble. Movement 3, Canción de Adelita, is Chávez's setting of the famous canción ranchera La Adelita. A canción is a traditional mestizo style defined by sentimentality and pathos. The canción ranchera is a specific style of this genre born during the revolution of 1910 to 1920, often featuring patriotic subjects and soldiers' lives. La Adelita is a song about a legendary female soldier of the revolution and the virtues she represents for women of the revolution. Unlike original canciones, which make considerable use of rubato, the canción ranchera is played in the style of a corrido, accompanied by mariachi ensemble. A corrido is a type of group dance with 2 lines of dancers. Corridos can be represented in simple duple paso doble, but more often in a triple meter. La Adelita and Chávez's arrangement are in simple duple time and in strophic form. Chávez deviated from the original tune with alterations to the accompaniment patterns, along with truncated and overlapping melody segments. These deviations signify his desire to break elements of repetition and generate a musical atmosphere. The movement begins with the statement of the primary melody in the first clarinet and brief moments of accompaniment by the low brass. The first and second cornets follow with a humorous trill on low B flat, which is indicative of a grito, a type of musical scream often heard in mariachi performances. The melody continues as the accompaniment is gradually pieced together into a recognizable corrido style, creating an atmosphere of a party setting where the musicians gradually join in the performance. The work proceeds in typical fashion until measure 58, where Chávez begins overlapping statements of the melody and leading to a strong cadence point at measure 95. From measure 100 to the end, there is a final truncated statement of the melody, followed by an ending gesture that dramatically cadences in slow, romantic fashion, typical of the way mariachi ensembles conclude ballads. Each of the 3 movements of Chapultepec has strong elements of mestizo and mariachi music, which influence performance practices and stylistic considerations. Understanding the facets of mestizo and the resulting performance practices of mariachi ensembles can provide insight into Chávez's chosen articulations and stylistic considerations. For example, mariachi music is characterized by a consort of chordophones, referred to as an armonia, composed of the guitarrón, vihuela, harp, and standard guitar. The armonia uses percussive strumming patterns to accompany expressive and lyrical melodies that are sung or played on the violin and or trumpet. Bass voices playing on the downbeats should be approached with a secco and prominent articulation, emulating the sound of the guitarrón. Chávez supplies the staccato and staccatissimo markings to ensure this style is achieved, as seen in this example. In mariachi performance practice, players will typically add a slight accent on the last upbeat or beat in each measure to create a more robust representation of the idiom. For Marcha Provenciana and Canción de Adelita, this inflection falls on the upbeat of beat 2. For Vals Nostálgico, the inflection falls on the 3rd beat of every measure. Moreover, any section marked cantabile with slurred markings and the concluding gestures of each movement should be performed with a dramatic and lyrical expression and the incorporation of vibrato. In programming Chapultepec for wind band concerts, this piece can function as a contrasting work peripheral to a more austere composition. The work is lively and mainly in a major mode and contains humorous gestures. However, Chapultepec's inherent value lies in its representation of music important to Mexican cultural identity and the application of mestizo performance practice. Please enjoy this performance of Chapultepec by members of the NAU Wind Symphony. Mañanas Mexicanas. Originally composed as an orchestral work with choral accompaniment, Mañanas Mexicanas is similar to Chapultepec in its representation of nationalistic pride. In 1934, Chávez composed Llamadas, Sinfonia Proletaria, to address the proletarian struggle against tyranny by the common man. Llamadas was reworked in 1967 as Paisajes Mexicanos, translated as Mexican Landscapes, for orchestra, and a version titled Mañanas Mexicanas, translated as Mexican Mornings, for concert band. Mañanas Mexicanas represents Chávez's musical intent of generating atmosphere and celebrating Mexican qualities in music. Chávez wrote in the preface to the printed score, "Mexican Mornings is a simple melodic piece, very much seasoned by Mexican quality. Not one single quotation of folklore is to be found in these mornings, but the colors of the land, the scent of the orchards, and the accent of the local speech make it relate to idiomatic expression." Chávez expresses these impressions of Mexican qualities through a set of free variations. The introduction of the work, measures 1 through 10, features a polychordal chorale that concludes in the chord built upon stacked fifths. The modernist harmonic approach of using stacked fifths is a compositional trend used by composers of the mid-1900s that composer Vincent Persichetti codified in his text, 20th Century Harmony, Creative Aspects and Practice. These extended harmonies shift the musical focus from harmonic progression to color and texture. The first two variations are light and dance-like, indicative of the mestizo idiom, and feature simple modal melodies harmonized in thirds. Again, Chávez applies staccatissimo articulations to the accompaniment gestures to emulate mariachi performance practices. The third variation begins at measure 104, marked andantino, and the melody is presented by the trumpets harmonizing in fourths, shifting the musical impression towards Chávez's notions of indigenous music. The melody is surrounded by continuous changes of accompaniment that vary modernist harmonies against lyrical gestures, as seen in this example. The fourth variation, in compound duple meter, is highly indicative of a huapango, a traditional mestizo mariachi style of music. The huapango is a type of sones, or rural mestizo music, that features an unequal triple rhythm based on patterns of 6 beats. The style is lively and uses the duple and triple subdivisions of beats available in compound duple meter. The variation concludes with a sequence of bold accented quarter notes in a simple triple meter that transitions towards the 5th variation by decreasing dynamics and removing instruments from the orchestration, dramatically reducing the energy. The 5th variation, beginning in measure 192, has a stepwise melody in F major. The passage includes many dynamic shifts, fluctuating tempo changes, and the instructions espressivo and cantabile in both the melody and accompaniment. The 6th and final variation, Tempo de Marcha, begins in measure 237. This section establishes a march-like style and varies 2 themes through rhythmic and modal alterations. The piece abruptly concludes in a grand fashion similar to the opening chorale, utilizing the final chord constructed with stacked 5ths. From a traditional American perspective of concert programming, Mañanas Mexicanas can function as the serious or centerpiece work. Chávez' set of free variations observes the stylistic facets of Mexican music through a 20th century compositional lens. Moreover, Chávez also takes full advantage of the tessituras for each instrument, adding a significant level of difficulty. The conductor should be aware that a few gestures did not translate well from the orchestral version. For example, the end of the introduction demands that the bass trombone, baritone, and tuba use a flutter tongue on low F sharps. Chávez intended to mimic a tremolo played on a string instrument, an aggressive and constant reinitiation of sound. The effect is difficult on low brass instruments due to the lack of back pressure from the instrument to flutter tongue against, and ultimately diminishes the quality and intensity of the pitch. Therefore, in the performance you will hear shortly, the articulation is eliminated to preserve the intensity of the chord. Please enjoy this performance of Mañanas Mexicanas by members of the NAU Wind Symphony. Zandunga Serenade. In 1977, Chávez received a commission from Carl Fischer Incorporated to produce a contemporary composition for school bands. His modern approach to harmony and form and his established notoriety as a progressive composer made him an ideal candidate for broadening the availability of this genre for school bands. However, it is my belief that it was because of this complexity that the piece remains relatively unknown in the wind band repertoire. Zandunga Serenade is organized into a theme and variations with an introduction and coda. The primary theme is stated directly in the introduction by upper woodwinds. A secondary theme emerges in measures 8 through 9, and consists of a static set of 8 notes followed by a neighbor group in the saxophones and horns. In example 3 and 4, you will see that both themes feature a sustained or repeated pitch, followed by an appoggiatura, which naturally generates an emphasis on the last non-chord tone, resolving down by step. A total of 4 variations occupy the tonal areas of B minor, D major, F major, and A major respectively. A remarkable moment in this work occurs at measure 69, where Chávez employs the percussion section as a transitional vehicle to the coda. The snare drum is used as an ostinato, while the woodblock and timpani exchange rhythmic ideas. The musical treatment of percussion with motivic and colorful devices is a signature of Chávez's compositional style. The work concludes in a manner that matches other works explored in this paper, a dramatic slow drive to a final chord constructed of stacked fifths. Carl Fischer Incorporated published Zandunga Serenade with the heading Commissioned Contemporary Work for School Bands. As a result, Zandunga Serenade is in jeopardy of being overlooked for programming by collegiate ensembles. Furthermore, the modernist harmonies Chávez uses in this piece make the work difficult to appreciate on the first listening by those with a Western tonal perspective of music. Because of these perceived shortcomings, Zandunga Serenade is generally not included in traditional American concert programming for high school or collegiate ensembles. However, the value of this work lies in its lyrical nature, its exploration of complex harmonies used by Chávez, and the stylistic components of a Mexican waltz. Interestingly, Chávez's Zandunga Serenade has a striking resemblance to La Zandunga, the unofficial anthem of the Isthmus of Tejuantepec, composed by Máximo Ramo Ortiz. Both pieces are in a waltz style influenced by the jota, a Spanish form of music in a rapid triple meter with 4-bar phrases. The performance tempo chosen was faster than the prescribed tempo marking of 50 beats per minute to the dotted quarter note to better represent the jota dance feel of this piece. The jota was implanted in Mexico during the colonial era, and over time it was mixed with indigenous music to form a stylized Mexican waltz. Nonetheless, Chávez states in the preface of the printed score to Zandunga Serenade, though Mexican in quality, no folk melodies have been utilized in this work. And now, the final work of the program, performed by the NAU Wind Symphony, Zandunga Serenade. The three compositions by Carlos Chávez performed today, Zandunga Serenade, Mañanas Mexicanas, and Chapultepec, cultivate and celebrate Mexican national identity and provide insight into understanding the development and historical performance practices of Mexican music. The music of Chávez could be overlooked for regular programming due to his unconventional harmonic approaches, using chords and harmonic movement that may be difficult to contextualize for younger musicians. Another reason may be attributed to the publication dates of these works. The 1960s produced such works as Copland's Emblems, Variations on a Korean Folk Song by Chance, and Husa's Music for Prague 1968, which were viewed as compositions of merit for the wind band. This era of wind band composition was a continuation of an aggressive expansion of the wind band repertoire that started in the 1950s with Frederick Fennell. Prominent American conductors Michael Hathcock and Richard Floyd stated that Chávez's works were marginal in quality and never resonated enough to continue programming on concerts past the early 1980s. Another contributing factor to the perception of Chávez's music may be related to the institutionalized negative perception of the Mexican race throughout the 1900s. In the changing landscape of cultural perception today, the original constraints on Chávez's music and the music of other Mexican composers should be challenged and reevaluated. Further research can be targeted at identifying more Mexican composers and the inherent values their music contains. I suggest actively seeking and commissioning new works for wind bands by contemporary Mexican composers to add to the wind band repertoire. The presently changing cultural values and philosophies of inclusion are creating a more expansive world of music and music appreciation. However, due to the lack of accessibility and understanding of this style, it now begs, how many more compositions by Mexican composers exist and should be incorporated into the wind band canon? The established wind band canon of works long considered to be of serious merit has established an aesthetic philosophy that should be recognized. Including works by Mexican composers in wind band programming to fulfill a quota of inclusion does not correctly celebrate the values of either canon. Alejandro Madrid of Cornell University identifies that including Ibero-American and or Latin American music in history sequences does not increase the inherent value of any of the works included. Madrid states, expanding the canon to include Ibero-American music or Chinese music or Indonesian music would defy the canon's raison d'etre. The programming of these works should be approached with a transhistorical perspective that identifies each work's individual values in their own cultural context. A revised music selection method allows for the opportunity to identify new connections between music and explore a broader range of repertoire. Programming a more expansive selection of music from across the world and actively identifying and promoting the inherent value of such works will enrich the education of music students at all levels and broaden the scope of evaluating the merit of music. Thank you for your attention to this lecture recital, and que tengan buena noche.